Hello everybody. This week we will study the architecture of convolutional neural networks, a type of deep learning model used in computer vision applications. As explained in the previous week, we need an input data set to do machine learning. The input of a convolutional network, as presented here, is typically an array or tensor of numbers representing a set of pixel values. The size of the first two dimensions correspond to the dimensions of the input picture in pixels. The third dimension determines the channel dimension. A monochrome or grayscale image has just one channel. Therefore, the size of channel dimension is 1 for grayscale images. But, as you might know, an image from a standard digital camera has 3 channels: red, green, and blue. This type of images is known as RGB. In RGB images, red, green, and blue lights are added together to reproduce a broad array of colors. So, the channel dimension for color images will be 3. For instance, this slide shows a grayscale image. As we can see here, the pixel values are stored in a 2-dimensional tensor. It means that the channel size is 1 in this sample image. But, as we can see here, in RGB images, each pixel has a color specified by 3 values or 3 color channels: red, green, and blue. So we need a 3-dimensional tensor for storing the RGB image. The most common pixel format in images taken from digital cameras is an integer number ranging from 0 to 255. But for DNNs and CNNs, it is desirable to scale the pixel value data into a floating range between 0 and 1, as shown in this equation. Input data can be normalized by shifting and scaling the pixel data so that the mean value is 0 and the standard deviation is 1. It is because neural networks prefer to deal with small input values. So, input data should be formatted into appropriately floating point tensors before being fed into a neural network. After data preprocessing, it comes to creating a CNN model. In the following slides, I will explain the architecture of layers in CNNs. Layers in convolutional neural networks consist of a 3-dimensional grids of neurons. This convolutional grid operates over 3-dimensional tensors called feature maps. Each layer has 2 spatial axes, height and width. Position in these 2 dimensions roughly corresponds to the area of the input image that this neuron is sensitive to. Generally speaking, the dimension of grids is smaller than the size of input feature maps. Apart from height and width, each convolutional layer has a depth axis. Position in this dimension corresponds to a filter or kernel being applied to the input image or the feature map of the previous layer. As mentioned in the previous slide, each convolutional layer consists of grids of neurons, where the dimension of each grid is usually smaller than the size of the input feature map. Prior to transformation, a filter window slides over the input feature map and divides it into some patches. The filter window has the same width and height as the grid. Then each patch is transformed via a dot product with a weight matrix, producing a transformation patch. The values in this weight matrix is adjusted during learning. The output feature map is obtained by assembling all the transformed patches. In this slide, we have an example showing how a convolutional layer transforms an input feature map. As we can see here, the convolutional layer takes a three-dimensional tensor with a height and width of 5. In this feature map, the depth is 2. In this example, 3 different filters are applied to the input feature map, where the dimension of each filter window is 3 by 3. So, as shown here, the input feature map is divided into 3 by 3 patches. The filter window slides over the input map, extracting the 3D patch of surrounding features. Here, we can see some of the patches. Now, each 3-dimensional patch is transformed into a 1-dimensional vector of shape via a dot product with a convolutional kernel or a weight matrix. In this example, as mentioned earlier, 3 filters are applied to each patch. So, there are 3 elements in the transformed patches. Each represents the output of an individual kernel. Finally, all of these vectors are reassembled into a 3-dimensional output map of shape. In this output feature map, this output vector comes from the 3-dimensional input patch highlighted in gray. It should be noted that the output width and height may differ from the input width and height. This slide presents a layer including a kernel with dimension 3 by 3. As we can see, this 3 by 3 kernel transforms a patch of input data through a dot product with its weight matrix. The result is a single value given to the next layer. As mentioned earlier, this kernel slides over the input data, producing the transformed patches. In this example, we apply just one filter, and therefore the depth size is equal to 1. In practical implementations, there might be more than one kernel like this in each layer. We had this example in last week's lecture. This image presents a convolutional network with 2 layers. In the first layer, the CNN divides the image into some patches and learns a set of convolutions that react to low-level features in the image, such as horizontal or vertical lines. Then the successive layer builds on these primitive features to react to higher-level features at particular places in the image, such as eyes or noses in a network trained on animal classes. Finally, all these outputs are fed into one or more dense and fully connected layers that come to a final interpretation of the scene. Last week, it's discussed that the output of the dot product is passed through a non-linear activation function. In CNNs, we usually use ReLU activation function to calculate the output of neurons, but other activation functions defined in the previous lecture can be used, depending on the model structure and data. Softmax is another activation function that is used in classification problems, such as classifying emails into 2 classes, as spam or not spam. Generally speaking, when we use a neural network to implement a classifier tool including n classes, the final output layer will usually have n outputs. In other words, the final output layer is configured to output n values, one for each class in the classification task. In these applications, the softmax function is used to normalize the outputs so that each output is in the range 0 to 1 and their sum is equal to 1. Each value in the output of the softmax activation function is interpreted as the probability of membership for each class. For instance, this example presents a classification task including 3 classes. As shown here, the input data might belong to the first class with a probability of 70%, or it could be a member of the second class with a chance of 20%. So, softmax is a suitable activation function to be used in classification problems. In this slide, we have the architecture of the AlexNet convolutional neural network. This network classifies the 1.2 million high-resolution images in a subset of the ImageNet dataset into 1,000 different classes. As we can see here, the network consists of 5 convolutional layers and 3 fully connected layers. Since this network is a classifier, a 1000-way softmax activation function is used in the last layer. The input image is first transformed with 96 11x11 filters or kernels. Then we have another convolutional layer applying 256 filters, each 5x5. Finally, the last 3 dense layers infer a final interpretation of the problem. The AlexNet model takes an input image and labels it based on its content. In this slide, we can see 8 test images given to the AlexNet for classification. The correct label is written under each image in bold. We can also see the 5 labels considered most probable by the model under each image. We know that large feature maps increase the number of weight parameters in the model. To reduce the size of feature maps between intermediate layers, we can use the max pooling approach. This technique is used to avoid overfitting and to reduce the computational cost by reducing the number of parameters to learn. Let's explain the max pooling technique by example. Here we have a 4x4 sample matrix representing an initial input. To downsample the input representation, we apply a 2x2 filter running over the input. We defined a stride of 2 for stepping over the input. This way, the filters have no overlap with each other. So, as we can see here, the input data is divided into 4 regions. Now, we take the max of each region and create a new output feature map where each element is the max of a region in the original input feature map. The other method to downsample feature maps is the notion of strides. As explained in slide 8, filter windows slide over the input feature maps to extract the patch of features. For instance, the image on the left presents a 7 by 7 feature map. If we transform the input feature map with 3 by 3 filters and a default stride of 1, the output feature map is 5 by 5. It's possible to have strided convolutions. I mean convolutions with a stride higher than 1. For instance, if the stride size increases to 2, filtering windows are shifting by 2 units now, and the output volume shrinks as well, as shown here. In the practical lab, we will build and train convolutional networks for image recognition labs from scratch based on what we learned in today's lecture. We will also use the striding method to reduce the size of feature maps between intermediate layers. In the end, I strongly recommend reading Chapter 5 from the book Deep Learning with Python. Okay, this brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thanks for watching this video.